Hello, welcome to the next edition of Sweet Decks. I got 5 O's. We're at a decent competitive showcasing. Today, I got 6 decks, all of which are kind of interesting. Some of them I have talked about before. There is a brand new deck that's kind of just came out of nowhere. So that is going to be an interesting discussion. We have, some similar strategies that have been talked about, but, there might be small modifications, stuff like that. And they're just, of course, not just a legit meta deck yet. So that's what we're talking about today. If you guys like this series, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, hit that bell notification for future videos. So let's get to 1,000 subs together, and let's get into the deck list. So starting off, we have a Sorin Abzan vampire list, which is kind of weird about this list is it's not necessarily vampires, right? We have some sub-theme of vamps with the Ecker Drinker, whatever it is, Dusk Legion Zealot, Aetherborn. Our upper drops seem not necessarily to be zombies, like Mosswood Dread Knight, Murderous Rider, just Shieldred, Rankle, Thought-Knot Seer. So they're kind of a little bit more mid-rangey, but those are tunable pieces for the Redemption. Now with this card, what Redemption does for this deck, right, is it lets you have essentially 6 copies of Golta in your deck without actually having 6 copies of Golta in your list, right? Because you don't really want to see multiple. If you see it and not a Sorin, it's a feel bad moment because it's basically a dead card in your hand. So to compensate with this, instead we have more Redemptions than we do Goltas. So if we want to be able to assemble the Sorin / Golta, close the game out, we can assemble it. Of course, we still have the best pieces with Thoughtseize and Fatal Push. We have utility lands with Mutavault, as well as Dreadlands and Urborg, so we have some decent cards there. But we have a go long type card with Dread Knight. We can sack that to Redemption and then recast the Whispers to be able to do it again. So that's kind of nice little synergies. Now instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover, I think, the top 5 decks in Pioneer and discuss the sideboarding options, right? So one of the key decks is Mono Green. Of course, in that matchup, you would be bringing in the Extinction events. Maybe Rave Enfeeblement, but it's kind of tricky just because it only gets the Elf. But outside of that, that's fine, right? So you probably would end up bringing in the Extinction events and maybe Massacre Girl, because that does kill a decent amount of their threats, but maybe it's not worth it. You would probably end up going down. Aetherborn is kind of medium at best, right? So you can cut that. Also, Murderous Rider. No, Murderous Rider still gets Karn. Thought-Knot Seer is kind of mid, and Rankle's kind of mid. So coming out, you probably want to replace your 4-drops with something as a suitable target for the matchup. So you probably wouldn't bring in Massacre and substitute probably for Rankle, because Thought-Knot Seer is probably better to look at their hand, eat that stupid Karn out of their deck. Other than that, cutting the 2 Aetherborns for Extinction event, I think you should be good to go in that matchup. Next deck, right, is Rakdos mid-range. You're looking for grindy cards that could take over the game potentially. So in that matchup, you have... Are you bringing in Duress in that matchup? Honestly, I don't know about that matchup. Let's skip it. Let's go to Rakdos Sacrifice. That seems like a much easier deck to talk about. So in that matchup, right, you do kind of want Max Vandal. That does get the Oven, which is a very horrible card to face. So you could bring that in, which like I said, you could substitute probably for a Rankle or something like that. Seems like a reasonable sub out. Plus it lowers your curve, which is quite relevant. Back to Nature doesn't do anything. Raven Female does get the cap, but it's not really worth it. You probably want to bring in the Duress, probably, to get the Oven out of their hand before they could even cast it. And in that matchup, I also not a huge fan of Thought-Knot Seer. They don't really have any mid-range piece, so I would probably end up cutting down the Thought-Knot Seer, Rankle, a Drinker, up 2 Duresses, and Mass Vandal. So that's what I would do against Rakdos Sacrifice. If you have any comments at all, let me know down in the comments. But next is It Phoenix, which is another big deck. right? So that's where we have unlicensed Hearse and Go Blank for. Potentially Extinction Event if we really wanted to, deal with Arclight Phoenixes in that manner. Again, Thought-Knot Seer is not really needed in that matchup. Either is Rankle, so those two can come right out for the two Hearses. Also, Aetherborn, not necessarily the greatest, but actually I think I would cut the Drinker in that matchup. It's not really that impressive overall. So I would end up cutting two Drinkers, Thought-Knot Seer. Go up two Hearses and an EE, and we could probably go down a Thoughtseize for another EE. And that does increase your curve a little bit, but it does give more resilience and answers to the problematic cards within. And of course, last deck I'll talk about, I guess, is Lotus Field. So this is where Thoughtseer is really good in, right? Because exiling a problematic card. Duresses you would bring in. Ray doesn't matter. Back to Nature doesn't matter. That's probably more for Bogles. They have Unlicensed Hearse, which can, I guess, be somewhat of relevance. Go Blank is probably a bring in. Mass Vandal doesn't do anything. Sentinel, probably not, even though it does exile graveyards. Kalitas doesn't matter. So two Duresses, a Go Blank, and maybe Sentinel, right? Because exiling the graveyard can affect Leer, which is quite powerful. Also Chandra loops, but I guess that you want that more at when they're actually doing it. So Hearse would be better in that situation. So I guess maybe Sentinel's not really worth it either. So we have two Duresses and we have a Go Blink to bring in. Seems pretty reasonable overall. There's not really a tutorable target over here for that other components. Now for this matchup, I think you want to cut down on the curve just because they go off on turn 4. So Shieldred is good against them. Thought-Knot Seer is good against them. Rider can come out for a Duress. Rankle can also stay in because it does discard, which is quite powerful in that matchup. We have two Thoughtseizes can come out for the Duresses. And then we can cut a Murderous Rider for the Go Blank. Now we also can cut the other two Fatal Pushes, probably for Hearse, just to stop the Chandra loops. So that's probably all you really need, right? Because you don't really ever need Fatal Push. If you do have any kind of removal, you would want it to be probably Rider's better as a removal spell because it can be tutored and it can get the Leer, right? Which the Fatal Push can't get. That's definitely what I would do. Duress, like I said, Go Blank. And if you're really extending, if there's enough bad cards, you bring in Hearse. And yeah, I would cut down the Fatal Pushes, 2, 2, and 1. Yeah, Fatal Pushes, and then cut Aetherborn, because you kind of want the jank amount from Golda. So that is what I would do with this deck. Hopefully that helps a little bit better. Let me know down in the comment section if you guys like this formatting better. And all these lists will be in the description. So let's get into the next. All right, next on my list is Bard class. Now this version is built on the backbone of the Oath of Chandra, which is kind of interesting. And it has so many cantrips, Seed of Hope, Oath of Nissa, and Commune with Spirits to help dig for the Bard class. So it can get a little bit more consistency to get Bard class, which is quite powerful over the other version that recently got a 5-0. So we have basically a 2-2 split on most of the legends other than Ruby and Mox. Just because, of course, you don't really want multiples, right? Because you're comboing off. You only need essentially one of each. So it's kind of nice that this deck actually addresses a lot of those problems. And Oath of Chandra makes a lot of sense since it costs 1 for a bolt to target creature. This could be a sideboard card, but it's not terrible in the main. Now I have up the top 5 decks. So is it Phoenix, right? Right out of the gate. Is most played deck. We bring in Hearses and probably Torch just because they can't exile a Phoenix, right? These don't do anything since they do not hit not really a white or a blue card other than Thing in the Ice. You don't really need to protect your threats. This is blue and red. They don't really have enchantment removal for the Bard class. So essentially all you need is 2 Hearses and a Torch, right? Now for the Torch, you probably could just trim down 2 Seed of Hopes for the 2 Hearses and then cut a Chandra for the Torch. Since Torch is better since it exiles, right? And everything else could essentially stay the same. other than that, like I said, that's essentially, I think that's it. Yeah, so there's nothing else. So against Rakdos mid-range, right? This matchup's a little bit trickier because none of these cards do anything. Beseiju doesn't matter. So we have safekeeping we could bring in over Seed of Hope. And that's essentially it, right? It's kind of weird. So we have Nykthos next, right? So mono green. We have Alpine Moon for that matchup, a Beseiju for that matchup, and maybe a Torch, right? Because we do want to have plenty of answers for the elf. What can we go down in that matchup? So again, Seed of Hope is probably always the first card I cut. It's not as strong as these two, I don't think, personally. And there's a reason why there's 2 of these and a 4 and 4 of those, right? So 2 Seed of Hopes for 2 Alpine Moons to name Nykthos. Pretty reasonable. Torch in, you could probably just trim down a Commune with Spirits or a Oath, and you should be good, right? You don't really need to adjust these because since everything is, for the most part, is already a 1 of or 2 of, you don't really have conflict of interest. Outside of that, you could bring in Beseiju, which you would just cut a forest for, and that's essentially all you need to do. If, like I said, all these decks are in the description, let me know down in the comment section if you disagree with any of my sideboard suggestions, because I definitely am looking to improve. Like I said, I definitely want to know if you guys like this change. Next is Sacrifice, right? So Rakdos Sacrifice is the 4th most played deck right now. Ironically, we don't have a lot. We have Beseiju for a forest, so we can get the oven, but these don't stop anything in the deck. Safekeeping, they're in black and red. I don't necessarily think you have to worry about too much of bar class answers, but you could bring it in over Seed of the Hope if you really want to. Hearse doesn't really matter because they'll just end up bringing the cat back in response to you targeting it. And it's kind of hindsight, I wouldn't recommend it. So Torch is another possibility you could bring in for a little bit of removal. But since we can't really kill Mayhem Devil, that seems like a very tricky situation to be in. So you could just bring in a Torch for Seed of Hope, Beseiju in for a forest, call it a day. Next most played deck appears to be Boros Convoke. Now this matchup looks like you got barrages, you got rending volleys, and that is essentially it. You could bring in the Torch, but that's not necessary. So you have 5 pieces of removal you want to bring in. Seed of Hope's out, so that's 2 slots down, 3 more to go. I would trim 1 Commune, 1 Oath, and then maybe a Clothis as the 5th card, right? Or maybe Xenagos because it is quite expensive. I do realize that this version doesn't have the 3-drop Burgy to do a little bit of comboing with. So it looks like it's more of a mid-range actual bar class deck. So that's what I would do with this deck. And let's get into the next deck. So next on my list is a Neoform Atraxa Greasefang list that got a 5-0 in Pioneer. It's kind of interesting. So it's like shoving 3 decks into one, which is kind of, I think, really weird. So we have the Neoform, right, with Soul Flare and Scavengers. So those just eat up anything in our yard, like Zeltalpa. And we also have the backup Greasefang plan. We have a Caryatid as a mana dork to help ramp us into our later drops. And also it has Hexproof, which is quite nice for Soul Flare or Scavengers. We have Oracle to help set up our draw and loot. So that is a little interesting, I suppose. This deck is a 4-color deck, so keep that in mind if you pick it up. And Gaze to help fill our yard up with Salvage. But it primarily looks like it is a Sultai list with a splash of white for Greasefang, because let's be real here, you're never casting the Parhelion or the Zeltalpa. So it is weird, though, that this deck basically is getting rid of the Hootie McGee and the Tassiger to get the Greasefang package into the list. And since we only have one set of vehicles, like it's going to be a lot trickier to enable Greasefang. But that, I think it should be okay. Sideboard. So is it Phoenix? Top on our list, right? We have 2 Hearses we could bring in. Probably Archon of Emeria, because they do typically cast a lot of spells. And that's kind of the goal of the deck. So what's bad in that matchup? So we probably cut a Collective Brutality for a hearse, and we could trim a Zetalpa for a hearse, and then trim Tragedy, possibly for the Archon. Just trimming a bunch of numbers seems pretty reasonable. And I think Zetalpa / Soul Flare is not necessary against, is it Phoenix? You care more about interacting with them, preventing them from actually doing their combo. And if you really needed to, you could Stubborn Denial. Most of our creatures do have 4 power or more, except for these, of course. But if that is the case, you would be trimming back on your self fill up the yard type effects. That could be a possibility for game 3 if you see an overexert amount of graveyard hate. But if you win game 1, I would just do these 3 and you should be okay. If you lose, you might want to bring in the Denial, anticipating for the graveyard hate, but it seems pretty reasonable. Next on my list is Rakdos mid-range. This matchup, you don't really need any of these bottom cards. Path of Peril is kind of mid. Thoughtseize is only good on the play, so if you're on the draw, I wouldn't even bring them in. You probably just bring in Stubborn Denial. Again, Collective Brutality is not needed against that matchup. Then also you could just trim back either on a Zetalpa or Oracle. Seems pretty reasonable. And if you anticipate graveyard hate, you definitely could take out something else like the Greasefang package. But this deck is a lot more reliant on the graveyard than normal list. Next is the Nykthos ramp list, right? Mono green. Now, this matchup is also a little tricky, since you don't really need Denial. You could. Thoughtseize helps get rid of Karn, but that's essentially it. Same with Denial. You never bring in Sphere. Path of Peril to get rid of Elves probably is not your primary goal, especially since they probably already casted a Old Girl Troll in that time frame. Archon can help stop them, right? It can stop the combo. Like I said, these other ones don't really matter. So Archon could come in, and like I said, you could trim an Oracle of Tragedy. Seems like a reasonable swap out. Or possibly, or actually Urborg Scavengers, right? Because it is a 3-drop, and they probably will get outclassed relatively fast in the game. So maybe a Scavengers up a Archon, and then maybe a Neoform for a Thoughtseize. So two Scavengers, a Neoform for 3 Thoughtseizes, and a Collective Brutality for the other Thoughtseize. So that might be enough to combat getting a Karn out of their hand. Also to prevent them from comboing off with Karn, with Archon of Emeria. And they don't really have much answers outside of the Cityscape Leveler. So you should be okay until that point. But if you have any suggestions, this one's a lot harder. Like I said, for me, this is not necessarily my playstyle. So next we have Rakdos Sacrifice, right? And that matchup, you have Knight of Autumn. Seems like a reasonable target for this matchup. The destroy target artifact or enchantment does get the Oven. Path of Peril is not necessary. Thoughtseize you could bring in on the play to get the Oven out of their hand before they cast it. Denial's not worth it. So that's essentially all I would do. So if you're on the play, I would bring in Thoughtseize. You probably could just cut down the Scavengers, a Brutality, and a Neoform, and then also bring in Knight of Autumn. You would just cut back an Oracle Tragedy, and that should be okay. And last but least, we have Boros Convoke. Now, this is the matchup for Path of Peril, so we could bring all 3 copies of those in. Other than that, I don't think any of the other cards are worth it. Maybe Knight of Autumn for the life gain. We bring in the Path, go down to Collective Brutality, probably the Scavengers, because they're probably not necessary. And then we could also bring in Knight of Autumn, of course, maybe again over Tragedy, because this is definitely the weaker of the 2, in my opinion. So that's basically how you probably should play that list. Like, so this one's a little more skeptical because this is not my primary playstyle. If you think if I've suggested anything wrong, let me know down in the comment section, and I'll make sure to take that in a note for next time. Let's get into the next list. So next on my list is a Mardu Transmogrify / Fire's Vengeance / Beseech the Mirror list. Now, what sparked my interest about this deck is the 3 of Spirit Sister's Call, which doesn't see a lot of play in Pioneer. We have a lot of enchantments, so if that sparks your interest at all, which it makes sense because we are trying to Beseech the Mirror, right? So turn 3 or turn 4, Beseech, sacking a turn 2, turn 2 Saga seems pretty reasonable. And they all can be sacked to a Rite of Oblivion, so that's pretty good for a target removal spell. For token generation, we have Omen of the Sea, we have Fable, and the Birth of Melodus, right? This makes an 0/4 wall that we could transmogrify into an Atraxa. Against Izzet Phoenix, we bring in 4 Leyline of the Voids, probably go down Languish, also can go down Shatter the Sky, that's 2 cards. We also can trim back on a Blessing, and potentially, actually the Trial's also kind of mid. Silence, that also is a possibility. So if we bring in Silence, Leyline, that's 6 slots. We trim back on Trial, that's 4 of the 6 slots accounted for. And then we can cut back on a Languish and a Shatter the Sky, since those aren't really necessary. And you should be okay against that deck. Next, Rakdos mid-range. Now, this matchup, Slaughter, is that really the only card that's even relatively good in that matchup? Path to Peril makes no sense, since Silence is more for control. If you're on the play, Thoughtseize can be important. This matchup, I think Trial's not that bad. Languish and Shatter could be cut. But you probably would only want to cut one of them. Probably the Languish, because it can get Shieldred. Bring in Slaughter Games for the Shieldred. And I think that's essentially all you really kind of need to do. And like I said, if you're on the play, I would bring in Thoughtseizes, since you can disrupt their hand before they can go off. And you could probably trim down on the Bitter Reunions, potentially. And that's all you kind of really need to do. So that's what I would do against Rakdos midrange. Against Mono Green, on the other hand, this doesn't look like much for Mono Green, to be honest. So, Thoughtseize is only good on the play. You could, I guess, do it. But Trial's fine. This is really good, actually. Maybe Shatter this guy. So Languish. Cut Languish, go up Slaughter Games. And maybe 2 Silences to stop Karn on the combo turn. Is that even good? I don't think so. Nothing really sounds great in that matchup. Slaughter Games to get, of course, like I said, to get Karn is quite nice. That's all you really kind of need. I'm surprised this deck doesn't play EE. I would, because it's really good against Mono Green. And Beseech the Mirror does quite amazing things against them. But Rise of Flames and Trial both help on turn 2 to get rid of an elf or a Old Girl Troll. So that's pretty nice. This is probably worse against Old Girl Troll, but Rite of Oblivion is quite nice in them. So next is Rakdos Sacrifice. So this matchup, Leyline of the Void is not, that's a very tricky situation to want to evaluate there. It does help stop the cat oven loops. But other than that, what is it honestly doing? We have Thoughtseize, which you could use to get the oven on the play. Or Mayhem Devil, which is actually one of the better cards of the deck. We don't really necessarily need Shatter this guy. Languish should be enough, because most of the threats are 3/3s or lower. So you could probably cut Shatter this guy for a games to get the Mayhem Devils out of their deck, which is really going to hurt them. Other than that, I don't see a lot. I mean, is Thoughtseize better than Trial? Possibly. Just because Trial can't really get a cat, right? Because it just keeps looping. And if they have a cat and looping, they're just going to bring the cat back and sack it. So what's the point of this Trial? So maybe Trial is worse than Thoughtseize. And then you literally just bring in a Slaughter Games for the Shatter and call it Shatter the Sky and call it a day. Like I said, if you have any suggestions at all, let me know down in the comment section. Last but not least is Boros Convoke. Now this is going to be the easier one, right? So we have Path to Peril and we have Languish in this matchup, right? What do we go down? Target removal is not as great, so trial seems pretty mid. So we can cut 3 trials up 2 paths and a languish. And I think that might be it. You also can go down to the call. So 5-drop against a heavily aggro deck seems kind of mid. So maybe go down 1 call, 1 trial, another call. So 2 calls and a trial, up 2 path and a languish. That's essentially all you need for Convoke. So that is that list. Let's get into the next one. Next on my list is 4-color Venthyr. This got a 5-0, which is quite interesting to me. This deck kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, it used to be a deck and then it kind of died out because, I mean, it's very inconsistent. But we have 8 elves. We have 2 fauna shamans to help dig for any kind of threat. Recruiter for the haste ability. We have a Glasspool Mimic to help copy our corridor. And we have a specialist to get back a corridor. So that's quite nice. 1 of Knight of Autumn for a tutor target. Then we have Rona to help loot through our deck. So against the matchups, right? So is it Phoenix? Do you just want the 4 Leyline of the Voids and a Scavenging Ooze? And you should be okay, right? So Scavenging Ooze probably just replaces Knight of Autumn because that's kind of the quote unquote, optional tutor target. We have Leyline of the Void. So this, ironically, what are we cutting for this? Probably elf because he has a lot of burn at the 1-drop slot. And maybe 2 fauna shamans. Seems pretty reasonable, actually. You could go down Othanissa. That doesn't seem very good. And Agatha is just, well, of course, really good because it's also graveyard hate. So maybe you go up 4 Leyline, down 1 each elf, and down a fauna shamans because they also could easily be removed. And like I said, that's essentially about it. And then the ooze for the Knight of Autumn. So that is it Phoenix? Let's discuss Rakdos mid-range. Now this matchup, you could definitely want Elder Gargaroth instead of Knight of Autumn. It's kind of nice to have a 5-drop that draws cards. Outland Liberator doesn't matter. Archon doesn't matter. Leyline of the Void doesn't matter. So Strokes is the optional card here. Now what is actively worse? Probably cut elf up 2 strokes to get the 4 drops out of the deck. And essentially, I think that would be all you need. I wouldn't go a full playset. This is probably better against Mono Green. Like I said, I wouldn't go up a full playset of Strokes against Rakdos mid-range. They do have Shield Rib, but a lot of their interactions are 1-drop, 2-drop, and like Blood Tithe Harvester. The other is like a 3-drop. So they're kind of like efficient on 1, 2s, and 3s. Stroke, I don't think is as critical in that matchup, but I think some numbers would make you quite happy. And of course, like I said, I think 6 elves is enough, right? Because they do have Fatal Push still. So much removal for these 1-drop elves. So I think having a couple strokes over them makes perfect sense. And like I said, Elder Gargaroth and Knight of Autumn out. Just that extra card draw from the Gargaroth is going to help a lot against Rakdos midrange. Mono Green Ramp. Now, this is a deck, right? So you could bring in any of these on the top half of the deck. Archon of Amiri does stop their combo, but is it strong enough to delay them? Probably not. So you probably could go down up 1 Archon, down 1 Knight of Autumn, which is a tutorable target with Prime Speaker if you really need it and you can't combo off and win that turn. Otherwise, I would not cut Elf. You want to be kind of ramping yourself to keep up on tempo with them so you can combo off of Venthyr first. I would probably be trimming down on Rona, and a couple Fauna Shamans. Seems pretty reasonable. And maybe an Extraction Specialist. So 2, 1, and 1. Up 4 strokes. Because that gets most of the problematic cards. Karn, Cav, Cityscape Leveler. And then an Archon of Amiri comes in for Knight of Autumn. Because Knight of Autumn isn't really necessary. Even though this can technically get backside of Old Growth Troll onto the land. Also the Haven. But if you're wasting your time on that, it's probably not going to win you the game. And even with that, I think Outland Liberator could also be an option if that's what you're trying to disrupt. Like I said, it's definitely better than, I think, Knight of Autumn because it has an on-tax trigger. So, I mean, I guess you could just bring in the Liberator, but are you cutting the Rona for it? I mean, Rona helps dig for your Prime Speaker, which is like the most important piece. And then you have Tyvar to help give your Prime haste. So, I think you're good there. Sacrifice, you don't need strokes since they don't really top out about three mana value. Archon doesn't really matter. Outland Liberator is decent because it does get the oven. We have Leyline, not worth it. And maybe an Ooze, right? Because that also could help against the cat. And you could activate this multiple times. So that's where it's kind of nice. So if you bring in the Liberator and the Ooze, what are you going to cut for him? You could just do 1/1 of the elves, right? Because they kind of stink against a Mayhem Devil that just pings him for one point of damage. And I think that's essentially what you kind of want to be doing. Last but not least, we have against Boros, KebbieG. We don't really have any sweepers on the sideboard. So it looks like we're more of trying to race them. Stroke does nothing because they top out. I guess Stroke on turn 2 can get their KebbieG spell. That's essentially all it can do. Archon can slow them down, but you're not going to be fast enough, I think, to slow them down. There's very little there is some X number of artifacts, right? But I don't think it's enough to warrant a Liberator. Leyline of the Void is not doing anything. You probably won't ever get to the point of the game to cast a Gargaroth. And then we have Ooze, so you could eat a Graveyard and gain life, but it's not necessary. So at best, right, you have Liberator. And if you're on the draw, maybe Stroke. If you're really needing to counter the payoff, right? Now the question more is what is bad in that matchup? They don't have a lot of removal, so your elves are probably fine and you need to be fast enough to race them. Recruiter, pretty reasonable. Shaman, I'm not a huge Shaman fan, so I don't want to maybe try to be biased here because Rona is pretty reasonable. We have two ways of untapping this, so three. So we have essentially 9 cards to untap it, plus extra copies of Rona. So I definitely think you could try to make your way and possibly bring in some strokes, but trying to figure out what you want to cut and if it's even worth it. And Liberator could be. They do have some number of artifacts like clues. So you could sack this, blow up them in response to a Gleeful Demolition. But that's up to your discretion. I mean, you could bring them in. On the play and on the draw does make a huge difference, but whether or not this is good enough. So that essentially is this deck. I haven't played this deck yet, so I'm curious to see how my strategic planning actually works out. But if I ever get a chance to get this deck in, I think I could have a different opinion on the sideboard pieces. But definitely you could tell like certain ones are for Phoenix. Mid-range Rakdos, I guess maybe this is just already kind of favored. And the only thing that you probably want to do is protect your Venthyr in that matchup. So maybe that's why you want Archon maybe against Rakdos mid-range. Just so they can't double spell. But then again, they'll just kill your Venthyr and that's it. Let's get into the last deck on my list. Okay, last on my list is 4-color Bogles for Pioneer. And it's strictly 4-color because of black for Ghost form, which helps against Rakdos mid-range. So like that's like the only reason to be 4-color. Otherwise you're just Bant for the most part. What do we have here? We have 4 Audacities, a couple Sentinels Eyes to help prevent a Emperor from eating our White Paws, which is quite important. We also have Alpha Authority to put on to give a hexproof. We have a lot of these same draw effects that Bant usually offers, or Simic as well. But for the most part, you want your Obsessions and you want your Insights. Those really help against control, against mid-range pieces, where you're just trying to keep turning through your deck. We only have 12 creatures, which might appear to be too low. the Phoenix matchup. Denial doesn't make a ton of sense, since if it ever is good, it most likely will be in a situation where they can't really answer your scout. Your scout will be too big anyways. They can't do nothing about it unless it's Thing in the Ice. With Thing in the Ice, you would want to slip out the back to prevent that. So we don't necessarily have an answer to any kind of graveyard hate. So you probably bring in Slip Out the Back if you see Thing in the Ice. And of course you could just trim back on your auras portion. Blessing is not needed, so that's one cut. You could probably also go ahead and cut a Curious Obsession and actually a couple cartouches. So 2 cartouches and the Blessing to bring in 3 Slip Out the Backs. That should help you against Thing in the Ice, which is their best card in this matchup. Otherwise, you kind of have to hope and pray that you could close and beat them before you would see a Arclight Phoenixes coming back. So this is a deck that wants to race. Next is Rakdos Midrange. Of course, that is the matchup for Leyline of Sanctity. So those will come in. If you expect and you see Sheoldred's Edict, you might also want to Slip Out the Back. Other than that, that's all you need. So what would you trim in that matchup? You definitely want to keep the Insights and the Obsession. You could probably cut down the Form. So you can cut down the Form, the Blessing. The only sacrifice things they have, I guess they have Liliana, but probably not likely. It's more common that you would see a Sheoldred's Edict. So potentially you might want to cut the cartouches if they're not playing Edicts, right? If they're not playing Lily, and actually I think Slip Out the Back is probably better than Cartouche in the cases that you face a Edict effect. Because this one will flop against Sheoldred's Edict. This at least saves them still. So 2 cartouches, 1 Form out, up Slip Out the Back. Then you have Blessing, that's your 5th card out for a Leyline. I guess you can't do that much, right? You can't reduce that many. Yeah, you can't reduce that much against Auras against those matchups. So probably against Rakdos Sacrifice and Rakdos Midrange, you probably would do the same thing. Sanctity in, cut back on Form, Blessing, Obsession. Actually, Sentinel's Eyes is not as good. So 2 Sentinel's Eyes, a Form, and a Blessing for Sanctity. Seems pretty reasonable for a swap. Other than that, you could bring in Slip Out the Back for Cartouches, but that's essentially all I would do. You can't reduce your auras that much without taking a hit, right? So against Nykthos, right, mono green, you don't really need Stubborn. That's only really, you would bring it in for only Karn. It doesn't necessarily seem that great. You have a Sanctity, which doesn't matter. You don't really have that many rafts to deal with your stuff. You could bring in Portable Hole for the elves to slow them down enough. But in that case, you would probably end up trimming down on the Sentinel's Eyes. And you keep the Blessing because you need to be able to fight probably a Form. But again, that does make it where they can't be blocked. And they do have beefy guys. So if you did 2 cartouches and maybe a Sentinel's Eyes for 3 Portable Holes, and you're good against mono green. And I would say it's a very similar thing against Boros Convoke. You bring in 3 Portable Holes, cut 2 cartouches, Obsession, or Sentinel's Eyes. You could just go down 2 cartouches and 2 Sentinel's Eyes, up 3 Portable Holes, and a Rune of Substance, right? Because you want the lifelink against that matchup. You don't necessarily need to wrath the opponent's board. So that is all the lists that I have today to cover. Hopefully this video was good and entertaining. Let me know down in the comment section what you guys thought about this structure formatting, where I picked the top 5 decks in the format, just so you have a decent understanding of how to sideboard against those. I could have added the 6th most played deck, which is Hidden Strings, Lotus Field. But then again, most of these decks are the Lotus Field matchup, I think, is relatively easy to sideboard against. Even this deck right here, really, I think you're so far ahead when it comes to favored that you should be able to beat that matchup with very little help. You could bring in Denial to basically counter the pour over pages, stuff like that. That's essentially all you need. Let me know down in the comment section what you guys want to see next. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell notification before you head out that door. And until next time, hopefully you guys have a great rest of your day. Talk to you soon.